What I want to say before we go any further, you, Charles, and I did a show at Studio One 3 years ago. More than that.
5 years ago before you were supposed to do it.
Okay, and I remember the first, you, along with me, that black drag queen you always talk about.
Riding high on the west side, looking for a hood rat to play. Won't you come out and play?
So here we are at the Sylvester book. You know, I've been prolonging it because I was afraid that I was going to do it wrong. Okay, but I can't prolong it no more because it's in my craw and I got to get it out. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the most magnificent, whimsical ride, The Fabulous Sylvester by Joshua Gamson. Back in the 1960s, when Tiki Lofton was a boy, she used to wait until the 11 o'clock flight took off from LAX, right over her grandmother's house, and as the jet vroomed and her grandmother dozed in front of the evening news, Tiki would ease open her bedroom window and climb out to meet Monique Hudson. She would grab her goodie bag, and Monique would show up on the street corner with hers, and they'd head over to one of the discotheque apartments, like one on 92nd and Vermont that Miss Lurie had rented, and beat their faces and rat their wigs and listen to music and smoke weed and drink like the teenagers they had recently become. The first discotheque bash that Tiki went to was over on 120th in Athens at Etta James' house, sometime around 1965. Pause. You know, when we read the Etta James book, we knew that Etta James had a very strong relationship with the gays. In fact, later on in life, when it became difficult for her to make money off of her craft, meaning it was hard for her to get booked by promoters, the gays continued to support her, and that was how she was able to live. Etta, who would later be inducted into both the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, largely on the strength of her 1961 hit At Last, and the Betty Ford Center, largely on the strength of her smack addiction, was already a recording star and a friend to many local Los Angeles drag queens with whom she shared a brazen sensibility and a taste for platinum hair and pumps. When Etta James was out of town, her house sitter was Miss Foxy, whom the queens called the jack-o'-lantern or the pumpkin on account of her wide, gap-toothed smile. If you have not already viewed our Etta James Race to Survive book club playlist, I advise you to go on over there. It is a great ride. On one visit to the Etta James residence, Foxy's friend, Miss Larry Hines, had declared the place made for a party and sent out the call to gather. Had she known about any of this, says former discotheque Diane Moorhead, Etta James would have killed Foxy and Larry. Tiki hadn't started dressing yet and wasn't yet named Tiki. She was still a pretty gay boy, skin pearly smooth and light. To go to that first party, she had worn a cowboy hat, big wide bell bottoms, and earrings. A discotheque party was an art form. During the week, a few club members would head out to the Dolphins of Hollywood to get the latest 45 or 8-track, often something Dooney had heard on KGFJ. The club members would then meet for music appreciation night to play records and familiarize themselves with the new material. Just to get ready, honey, you had to, say Diane. Out on Vermont Street, where there were several black nightclubs, they'd pass out the address of that night's get-together. Or someone would decide to throw a party and word of mouth would fill up the place. Outside, cars would be double parked for blocks around, and there was a line to get in. You would see Cadillacs, Jaguars, Mercedes-Benzes, low riders, Mama and Daddy's cars, Diane says. You had bulldaggers, femmes, straight men, straight women wanting to just party, says former discotheque Jackie Hoyle, and just to see us. Inside, there might be topless dancers on top of tables, straight. Now, this typically would just be called a house party, because the way he is describing it is just a get-together at someone's house. And I told you that in my past, when we lived in Michigan Park, our house would be that house. My stepfather had a very large record collection, and the basement was just set up to party, while me and my little sister would be all the way upstairs on the third floor. Of course, the difference was you were not allowed to be that free, because my stepfather had rules. Okay, no, don't get on my furniture. Inside, there might be topless dancers on top of tables, straight folks who'd wandered in from nightclubs, and of course, black drag queens galore. 'Cause I know that beauty's only skin deep. Yeah, yeah, yeah. People danced to the Temptations, the Rolling Stones, Barbara Lewis, Wilson Pickett, Martha Reeves, Marvin Gaye. The discotheques themselves were more to be looked at than touched. They had taken bubble baths and washed themselves with Gina Tay. Oh, that stinky shiz. Oh, my bad, y'all. I know I said I wasn't going to be up to the shenanigans, but why in the world did people want to smell like old lady on the bus? Okay, I'm going back into character. Okay, pause. They had taken bubble baths and washed themselves with Gina Tay. They might be willing to get nasty later in the evening, but they had reputations and hairstyles to uphold, and they worked way too hard on their max factor to let just anybody mess it up early on. The discotheques, among them Dooney, Tiki, Monique, Diane, Benedetta, Shelley Newman, Jay Freeman, Barbara, Garetha, Tammy, Shirley Floyd, Jackie Kennedy, Jackie Hoyle, Cleola Balls, Miss Lala, Miss Luella, Miss Marcia, and Larry Hines, their founder and lifelong president, were a cross between a street gang and a sorority. They began gathering in 1963. In their own words, at least, they were the toast of mid-1990s Los Angeles. This was their fantasy. Everybody wanted to be a discotheque, says Diane. It was like Follies Bergère in the ghetto. They were the most fabulous girls around and the toughest. They could kick people's asses and look good doing so. They would sometimes kick each other's asses just for looking good. In fact, especially if someone looked too good, Tammy, tall and pimply, and rarely the center of attention, could go into the bathroom for what seemed like days and emerge a glamour girl. One night she showed up in her pink safari pants, pink fingernails and toenails, and wraparound sandals. Everyone agreed that this was Tammy's time to shine. Everyone except Larry Hines. Wigs flew, nails were broken, history was made. When the girls competed over clothes and boyfriends among themselves or with other queens, things could sometimes explode into jets and sharks' rumbles. Because I am a musical girl myself, if you don't know, Jets, Sharks is the two opposing gangs from the great West Side Story. And I'm not talking about this remake BS. I'm talking about the original West Side Story with Rita Moreno and, of course, Natalie Wood. But, oh, please look at the original. If there is nothing more beautiful than West Side Story. Where In my mind, I was a part of every musical I saw. Lala eventually bullied her way into the discotheques, aided by the fact that she could deliver clothing or wigs from a store she'd hit. I'll probably talk a little later on about how the gays were able to dress so well. Matter of fact, let me say this. The show Pose is very indicative of this book. Lala eventually bullied her way into the discotheques, added by the fact that she could deliver clothing or wigs from a store she'd hit. But though she was tough, she was not invincible. One time, for instance, when Miss Larry Hines and Lala were fighting over a boyfriend, Cleola held down Miss Hines while Lala cut off Miss Hines' hair. Queens jumped in cars and buses to console Miss Hines, who was known for growing her own dark blonde frosted hair and brushing it in people's faces. They found her sitting on some stairs with her hair in her hands, crying. Most were sympathetic, although Miss Luella, upon seeing Miss Hines' big hairless head atop her tiny body, privately called her the Screaming Skull. Next weekend, next party, Miss Hines arrived in a wig the same exact color with the same exact blonde frost and the same exact length as the tresses that Lala had chopped off. It was a solid fuck you victory for Miss Larry Hines and his adherents. Further proof, if any, were ever needed, that there is no weapon more powerful than the right hair. In peaceful times, though, the discotheques were about the look, the entrance, and the scene. Without much money, this could be a challenge. Once, when she was still a penniless schoolboy, Tiki dyed her hair with red food coloring, which melted down her face that day in the schoolyard sun. Social events brought in some funds, as with Harlem rent parties in the 1920s and 1930s. Whoever threw a due would charge people 50 cents or $1 to get in, which helped pay for the apartments. Some of the queens, like Diane Moorhead and Jackie Hoyle, had jobs to get pennies for our fashions, using their pay to buy material beads, wigs. Some were too effeminate to be employable, as Jackie puts it. Ain't nobody going to hire you with no eyebrows. Many lived with mothers or grandmothers who would slip them money once in a while. Several worked at the airport, a different girl in each terminal. Shoplifting was a useful and often used craft. One queen, for instance, known for her fur fetish, would dress up in a moving man's uniform and simply wheel a whole rack of minks from a store. Other entrepreneurs made money on the street if you couldn't steal the dress, says Marapasa, who had joined the scene as a freckly 14-year-old named Charisse. Then maybe you would turn a trick. You had to be resourceful. When most of the girls' discotheque club members or not grew dissatisfied with water balloon bosoms and towel hips, a lot of them took hormones since, as Duchess tells it, everyone wanted titties and the soft hip flow. Many took to cutting up store-bought foam or furniture or car seats from Cadillacs, of course, to make themselves a body. Dooney, the future Sylvester, taught them how to whittle foam pieces with a razor blade, tapering them down the thigh and up towards the waist. They would cut the rear out of a girdle and insert a foam ass and hips, and sometimes getting ready for a party would be not unlike suiting up for a football game. The discotheques knew it was illegal to drag in their hometown as everywhere else in the country. The police still called such behavior harboring a disguise or masquerading, and could send you to jail for wearing an item of female clothing or lining your eyebrows. A city law rule number 9 made impersonating the opposite sex illegal. The future Sylvester was constantly scribbling designs. He would read about princesses and queens in exotic places far, far away from his own neighborhood, and he'd imagine their clothes. He could transform a face beyond recognition and rat a wig like nobody's business. Dooney was tall and big-boned. He fluctuated between pencil-thin and slightly chunky, with an oval face that looked good with any hairstyle and skin that was so soft and smooth. People likened it to whipped chocolate. Ooh, I would agree. People looked to him for all kinds of support. Marapasa says, but mostly beauty support. Even among the discotheques, you would notice Dooney first. There's a line of us, and then there's Dooney, Diane says. He would tear out a page from Vogue and put it in his purse one day, and the next he would look a lot like that picture. He might be a teased up redhead, or he might have a huge black natural, or maybe just a bun sitting there like an upside down bowl of pudding. When Elizabeth Taylor did Cleopatra in 1963, Dooney was the first to have her bangs. And when Funny Girl came out in 1968, Dooney had Streisand's frothy back hair. Home in D.C., Soul Train came on at 5 o'clock, and before 5 o'clock, like I want to say like between 12 and 5, me and my grandmother would sit there and watch TV all day until the Soul Train came on. And that's how I know a lot of these musicals is because they used to play the musicals on regular television. Now you want to see a musical, you got to pay $13 for it. What kind of trash is this? When I seen Funny Girl at the age of like 6 or 7 years old, I believed that I was Funny Girl. I knew that I was going to get later on when I was old enough to date or fall in love. I knew I was going to get some dum-dum that was out of control, and I was going to have to choose between love for myself and chasing some dum-dum. I knew that, and that's been the story of my life, child. For a while in between, partly to trick Lala out of stealing the wig right off his head, Dooney wore a platinum blonde wig and rubbed the top with black shoe polish, so it looked exactly as if his own roots were growing out from a dye job. With Dooney, Diane says, it was always an ongoing saga. What's she gonna do next? Dooney would come on a pogo stick. It didn't matter. She was her only competition because nobody was on her level. Dooney could always walk away with the spotlight. Honey, without even making a big deal out of it. Later, when everyone was sick or dying on the day 1986 turned into 1987, Sylvester, who had not been Dooney for almost 20 years, made an appearance on The Late Show where Joan Rivers was hosting a festive New Year's Eve. Sylvester plopped down on the couch next to the preceding guest, the Tony Award-winning actor and 70s game show host, Charles Nelson Riley. It was hard to imagine a queenlier trio. Riley, whose childhood nickname was Mary, Gossipy Rivers, the drag queen without a penis, and Sylvester. After a bit of chit-chat about jewelry and furs and Sylvester's boyfriend, Rick Sylvester, reminded Rivers and Riley that they had all three done one of the earliest AIDS benefits together several years earlier, before AIDS benefits were the thing to do. The two of you, he said, and me, the black drag queen you always talk about. Apparently, Miss Rivers did not hear that warning in his words or the hurt he had felt at being reduced to a label. What do you wear in real life when you just want to be Mrs. Rick? She asked, plainly assuming that Rick played Mr. to Sylvester's Mrs. Sylvester laughed despite the hint of strained patience on his face and spoke vaguely about having something for everyone. Joan Rivers persisted. So what did your family say when they found out you were going to be a drag queen, she asked. Sylvester gave her a look. I'm not a drag queen, he exclaimed sharply. But with a big, full-toothed smile sitting in his wig, makeup, and jewelry, he threw his head back and held his arms to his chest in a small self-hug, laughing. I'm Sylvester. Dooney was not a drag name. Sylvester's little brother named him that. Where Dooney grew up in the heart of nearly all-black South Central Los Angeles, if you were given a nickname as a child, people would have to think long and hard to call up your given name later in life. Pause just to say this, forgive me. So my sister's nickname is her middle name, okay, which is totally not related to her first name. My nickname is Nene. My real name is Renee. So, of course, I could correlate the two. My sister, when she got into school, she didn't even realize that her name was her name. The teacher was sitting there calling her da-da-da, da-da-da, and she was like, who is this lady talking to? That's not my name, because my sister had no idea until she got to school that her name was her name. Males, in particular, seemed to get renamed early on, and it was not unusual to find grown men around Watts and Inglewood going by names like Frog or Boy. Dooney's father was named Sylvester James, but everyone knew him as Sweet. In 1947, newborn Dooney was also given the name Sylvester, but it wasn't until he became famous that folks he grew up with in Watts knew him by that name. Boy was Dooney's uncle, Willie James. Dooney's cousin was called Flute. Dooney's brother, John Wesley, was known as Dutta. His stepfather, born Robert, was called Sonny. But when it came right down to it, the men were neither here nor there for Dooney.